this thing. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to Community Conversations today. I want to give a couple of announcements before we get started with this week's speaker. Firstly, next week, we're going to have Trey Beatty, an anthropologist, come and talk about cultural hegemony and manufacturing consent. So please join us for that as well. That will be 12 noon, just like this, next week. You can click on the link on the schedule from our website. And our spring series is going to be looking at race in America and beyond. Those events will be starting on April 15th. So keep an eye on our website for more details as we hammer that one out. The schedule is not finished yet, but that's when we're going to be starting. So we'll have more information on that as we go. But this week we have someone new coming to Community Conversations, which is one of the things I love to do, is to get new people involved. And this is Melissa Johnson. Melissa Johnson was born and raised in Portland, Oregon. She attended Mount Hood Community College before earning her BA and MA at Portland State University. Go Vikings? Yes. Okay, Vikings. She earned her PhD from the University of Michigan. Go Blue. In 2019 and teaches at LCC and Mount Hood Community College. This talk is drawn from her current book project, An Exploration of Women's Gossip in Colonial New England. Please welcome Melissa Johnson.
Thanks, Courtney. And thank you for inviting me to talk today about my favorite subject, which is Puritan women. I have devoted most of my adult life to studying them, and a lot of what I do is a form of myth busting. Because when I mention the Puritans and the Pilgrims, most people have three immediate thoughts. Thanksgiving and witches are the obvious ones, but there is also this overwhelming sense that these were people who hated fun, who dressed in all black, who found glee in punishing people for joy. And that's not what we're talking about today. The Puritans I know were people who liked beer, who wore colorful clothes, and who advocated for healthy sex lives among married people, of course. And they were also people who embraced gossip in their spiritual and social lives as a way of maintaining order and policing the boundaries of their society. And they were people who believed in the power of women's words, both for good and ill. So today I want to give you a sense of why I find the Puritans so fascinating, dispel some misconceptions about gossip as a form of communication, and propose that learning about early New England can help us understand the present. My slides are not working. There's one. So I wanted to, before I begin, mention that my discussion will include some talk about sexual assault. This won't be explicit, but it may be difficult for some people to hear. I will also acknowledge that sex is a thing that happens. So if you have littles or other folks listening in with you, this might be a good time to pop in those earbuds. So let's start with a couple of basic definitions. First, what's a Puritan? Really briefly, Puritans were a faction of Protestants from England who believed that the Church of England had been insufficiently reformed. So they were sort of extreme Protestants, and they wanted to purge every vestige of Catholicism from their churches. And they thought that individual churches should be self-governing, so they shouldn't have a hierarchy with bishops and with a pope. And they wanted to be able to limit membership in those churches to only those people who met their standards. The Puritans we're concerned with today are those who settled in New England. And I know people on the West Coast don't always have a good grasp on the geography of New England. So we're talking about what is now the states of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, and Connecticut. We're going to leave out Rhode Island. And the Puritans you're probably most familiar with were the Pilgrims, who were a faction of Puritans who settled in Plymouth Colony, which is now part of Massachusetts. The second definition I want to offer is gossip. And one of the things that happens if you're a historian of gossip is that your friends send you things like this screenshot from Animal Crossing. But I do think Marshall here helps me make a point. Gossip is usually seen as malicious and inappropriate, and people who gossip are shameful and vicious and catty. But what I want to argue today is that gossip can also function as protection, as a weapon wielded by those who lack power. So I use a broad definition of gossip that includes at least two people talking about another person who isn't present. The information exchanged tends to be personal rather than political, about affairs of the household rather than affairs of state. And gossip can be painted as pernicious, specifically because it gives power to people who were otherwise subordinate or powerless. Gossip certainly can be and is often wielded against the vulnerable to create a reputation that can't be repaired. But it can also be a powerful leveling tool when it's used by a group to guard themselves from people who are otherwise protected. So, for example, a servant girl could lose her livelihood if it became known that she had loose morals or sticky fingers. But that same servant girl might use her gossip network to make known that a certain master had handsy problems of his own. So gossip is a tool that can be used in different ways on different problems, and the results are often unpredictable. But if we strip away those assumptions that it's always bad and always false and always wrong and always done by women or girls, we might better be able to assess how it works. And then the final definition that I want to give you is watchfulness. You might think that Puritans would have hated gossip and hated women's speech, but um, this colony that hanged witches and Quakers also used gossip as a mechanism of social control in New England's Puritan societies and relied on women to communicate information. What makes Puritan New England so fruitful for investigating gossip is that their religious lives were governed by this thing called watchfulness. Generally, this was religiously sanctioned community surveillance. It meant being alert for signs of godly behavior or of sin, of order or disorder in others, in oneself, and in the world. So people who became members of New England's congregational churches signed a covenant, and it included an agreement to watch over and be watched over by other church members. So watching each other and reporting what they saw was not just being nosy, they were keeping their community safe. Pious members of the community were expected to keep watch on their neighbors and even their family members, and to intervene and encourage repentance. But if they saw no evidence of reform, they were supposed to report that sinful behavior to authorities. This means that talking about transgressions, like, say, an abusive minister, was not necessarily about keeping women safe, it was about protecting the community at large. So now we're going to get to the part that you've been waiting for, which is the stories. People often laugh when I say that I study Puritan sex scandals, but what makes these stories funny isn't that they're strange, it's that they're all too familiar. We just don't expect it from Puritans, and we've been conditioned to see them as sort of uptight caricatures from reading The Crucible or The Scarlet Letter in high school. So ministers are the celebrities in early New England. And they were particularly vulnerable to sex scandals because they often found themselves alone with women in situations of spiritual intimacy that could very easily be mistaken for a different kind of intimacy. They met with women in private spiritual conferences outside the supervision of male family members and the community at large. Ministers were also meant to maintain high standards of behavior, and they had a really important role in modeling good order. So when rumors surfaced about their intimate lives, it forced communities to confront situations in which the clergy became a source of disorder and violated the trust of their congregants and threatened the reputations of their communities. Sexual indiscretions also became evidence against ministers who had otherwise transgressed in public ways, often through politically aligning themselves in ways that were offensive to other male authorities. So in this way, the scandals that I'm going to talk about today transcended religious life and became political scandals as well. To say that accusations of sexual misconduct were enmeshed in political strife is not to say that the rumors were unfounded or that the women were being manipulated into reporting. The women had nothing to gain and everything to lose by levying these charges. In the eyes of their churches and their communities, they could easily be blamed or judged culpable, even if they claimed to have been forced or coerced, especially if they didn't report the incident to men in authority. So New England is a complicated place for women. It's a religious culture in which they were empowered to threaten the authority of ministers through accusations of immorality, but also one in which ministers could easily be forgiven, and in which women's own reputations were as much on trial as those of the adulterous clerics. Threats to women's safety seem to have been taken seriously in the case of ministers who were perceived as predatory, and a surprising number of ministers were unable to overcome allegations that they had preyed upon female congregants or servants. These cases show that ordinary women had the ability to shape events through their watchfulness and their gossip, but also that their power was limited by authorities' willingness to hear and heed those words. So we will start in Plymouth, which is the first permanent English colony in New England and home to the celebrated Pilgrims of American myth, whose flight to America was largely motivated by their religious faith. So it might surprise you to learn that when Minister John Lyford arrived in 1624, it was a huge relief because the colony hadn't had any ordained religious leadership since they arrived in New England 4 years earlier. Any relief they felt was short-lived, however, and the rapid end of Lyford's New England ministry soon became notorious. Before the year was out, he was banished from the colony as an enemy to the plantation. He was dogged by rumors and scandals. He had been revealed to be a fomenter of dissension, a traitor to their cause, and a flagrant adulterer. And he was blamed for hastening the end of the already contentious relationship between Plymouth colony and the London adventurers, who were the financial backers of the colony. So Lyford arrives in Plymouth. He becomes a church member, and he's also brought into the inner circle of colonial leadership. But Lyford also made common cause with a man named John Oldham, who was a trader who had previously been an opponent of the colony's leadership and who they hoped was now mending his ways. Spoiler alert, he was not. And here's a little Easter egg for any of my students who might be watching. Oldham was, he later became famous when his murder was made the pretext for launching an attack on neighboring Native Americans that's now known as the Pequot War. So Lyford and Oldham formed a secret faction that opposed Plymouth's leadership. And their mission was both to undermine the Plymouth Church and to disparage the colony among their contacts in England. Leaders of the colony were very concerned that the men would damage Plymouth's reputation among their supporters at home, because that would threaten their ability to secure financial and material support, as well as recruit badly needed new settlers. So the tension among Lyford and the colonial leadership came to a head when the governor intercepted some letters Lyford had sent to the colony's enemies in England, which essentially proved that he was acting as a spy. And the letters also proved that Lyford and Oldham were trying to set up their own church that would adhere to the Church of England, which was the church that these settlers had fled to escape. The Plymouth Church accused him of knowingly deceiving them at the time of his admission to the church as part of a calculated, premeditated effort. He was also convicted on criminal charges, and he was sentenced to banishment, but he was given a reprieve of 6 months, during which they hoped he would repent. So you might be thinking at this point, this is all sort of boring, political, religious stuff. Where's the juicy bits? Well, here they are. At this point, John Lyford's wife began to talk. Sarah Lyford was apparently so distraught about the threat of banishment that she now decided to tell a deacon and some of her friends about what she called her grief and sorrow of mind. She told them that before she got married, she had heard what she called some dark and secret mutterings that her intended husband had fathered a child with another woman. And she confronted him and he denied the rumors. And so she agreed to go forward with the marriage, but the story was later proved true. And as she said, the bastard brought home to them. The Lyford's marriage was plagued by infidelity. And Sarah Lyford said, quote, "She could keep no maids, but he would be meddling with them. And sometimes she has taken him in the manner as they lay at their bed's feet." So in other words, he's messing around with their maids while Sarah's in the bed with them. Two representatives of the Plymouth colony went to England, and when they came back, they brought another story about Lyford's past that had been reported to them by some friends of the company. These informants told the colony's representatives that one of Lyford's parishioners in Ireland had sought his opinion about a woman that he wanted to marry. And so Lyford met with the woman several times in private conference and confirmed that she would be a good wife. So the couple got married, but shortly thereafter, the woman told her new husband that in those private meetings, Lyford had, quote, "overcome her and defiled her body." Lyford had left Ireland for the colonies shortly after, and it's probable that he was trying to avoid punishment. So when these stories became public among the Plymouth colony's leadership, Lyford was forbidden from ever serving as minister there again, and he left the colony. He wandered around a bit. He eventually ended up in Virginia. The scandal severed relations between the colony and its London investors. And Sarah Lyford, her reputation seems to have been unsullied. She returned to New England after Lyford died, and she remarried, and she was evidently a woman of good repute until her own death in Massachusetts in 1649. Many of the early records of Plymouth colony were lost, but we know about Lyford's scandals because in the later 17th century, defenders of the colony used his sexual misdeeds to argue that he was a man who couldn't be trusted, and therefore all of the things that he said about the colony were untrustworthy. By the early 18th century, the scandal of his adulteries completely receded from the narrative of Plymouth's early history, and all that remained were warnings that his religious and political treachery could be replicated if New England was not vigilant to prevent deceitful impostors who might try to ingratiate themselves with well-intentioned but misguided believers. While versions of this story shifted depending on the goals of the authors, what did not differ was their near complete erasure of the women that Lyford was said to have harmed. His wife was not named in these histories, and neither were the women who claimed to have been seduced, assaulted, or exploited by him. Sarah Lyford's status as a wife and a woman with a good reputation was the only evidence that the reader was supposed to need to evaluate her claims. Her stories were further supported by the fact that she had told them to the deacon in addition to her female friends, which made them more reliable than if she had just whispered them among other women. Colonial representatives investigated Lyford because of their political concerns, and the immorality they found gave them cause to expel him from the colony. Gossip that might otherwise have stayed largely unknown became public knowledge, and private or secret encounters were brought into the public eye because of religious and political threats to the colony. While the leaders of Plymouth colony clearly took the accusation seriously, they might never have come to light without political motives that instigated a search for damaging information. So, in relegating the women to the background of Lyford's story, later chroniclers also erased the ways that women's words, whether told to husbands or friends or church elders, could be deliberately used to shape political events. Now, Courtney, this is the story that I promised to tell you about a year ago. You're finally going to get it. The women who accused John Lyford were believed both at the time and afterward. But in the case of another wayward minister, there has been deep investment among antiquarians and genealogists to discredit women's words and to rescue the minister's legacy. And that minister was Stephen Batchelor. When he arrived in America in 1632, he was 70 years old, and he settled in Lynn, Massachusetts, which is sort of in the middle of the coastline of Massachusetts there. And he lived with his daughter and his son-in-law, and he started holding religious services among his compatriots in Lynn without undergoing any formalities of ordination or getting permission to form a church. And after just 4 months, he was forbidden to preach because he was suspected of having independent ideas. But he kept on trying to organize his own church. And for several years, the town government fought him on this. And finally, he was brought to court and he was told that he needed to leave within 3 months. So by the winter of 1637, 1638, he was in Yarmouth, which is on the peninsula of Plymouth Colony, the sort of flexed bicep down there at the bottom. And he reportedly traveled there on foot at the age of 76. He tried to start a church there, but he met with opposition and moved on again, this time to Hampton, which is up in New Hampshire. And he arrived there in October of 1638, accompanied by his wife, his friends, other family members, followers, and he became the pastor of a church in Hampton. And he shared duties in that church with a man named Timothy Dalton. Batchelor and Dalton did not get along, and their simmering disagreements broke out into public controversy in 1641. But when news of that controversy traveled through the colony, it didn't focus on theological disagreements. Instead, word began to spread that Batchelor, who was now about 80 years old, quote, did solicit the chastity of his neighbor's wife. Batchelor denied the accusations, and he accused the woman and her husband of slander. But when he was brought before the church on disciplinary charges, he admitted that, quote, he did intend to have defiled her if she would have consented. So in other words, he wanted to commit adultery, but she wouldn't let him. Batchelor claimed that these charges had been drummed up by Dalton as a way of getting him out of the pulpit, and he wrote letters to members of the colonial elite, including John Winthrop and ministers of Boston's churches. He argued that he was innocent. He asked for help resettling somewhere else. And while he's doing that, he's still in Hampton. And the colonial government noticed that the whole town was divided into two factions. And they noticed that Batchelor seemed to cause trouble wherever he went. They said Mr. Batchelor had been in 3 places before, and through this means, the churches fell to such divisions as no peace could be till he was removed. Finally, Batchelor left Hampton and moved to what is now Portsmouth, on the border of New Hampshire and Maine. He was there by 1647. At this point, he is 90 years old, and once again found himself facing a sexual scandal. His wife died, and his neighbors provided him with a housekeeper, and stories began to circulate about his relationship with this housekeeper. Batchelor wrote to the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, Governor Winthrop, and said, it is a world of woes to think what rumors detracting spirits raise up, that I am married to her, or certainly shall be, and cast on her such aspersions without ground or proof. So despite claiming that this was mere gossip, he did in fact marry his housekeeper in 1650. One of his later biographers described the marriage as in every way unfortunate. Less than a year after they married, Stephen and Mary Batchelor petitioned for divorce, but they were ordered by the court to live together as man and wife. The divorce petitions and the court's decision likely related to the fact that Mary Batchelor had been brought up on charges for vehement suspicion of incontinency with her accused lover. The two were cited for living in one house together and lying in one room, and they were ordered to be separated, and they were convicted of adultery. Mary's accused lover was sentenced to flogging, and Mary was to be both whipped and branded with the letter A, probably on her cheek. And that punishment was unique in colonial Maine and has led at least one historian to suspect that her story might have been the inspiration for Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. Batchelor then returned to England alone, but they'd never actually gotten a divorce. And in 1656, Mary Batchelor petitioned again for a divorce, and this time she said that she had been credibly informed that Stephen had remarried in England and was therefore now a bigamist. No evidence has been found to prove or disprove that claim, and Stephen Batchelor reportedly died in England sometime between 1656 and 1660. If the latter date is correct, he would have been about 100 years old. You might be surprised to learn that Stephen Batchelor is not remembered as infamous or humorous or embarrassing, however. He is largely celebrated as the founder of Hampton. Genealogists and amateur historians, many of whom are his descendants, have made something of a cottage industry out of clearing his name. Those authors attempted to discredit Batchelor's wife, who they called a wicked woman, and who they said inveigled him into the marriage in his extreme old age. And they said that she was anxious to do her husband all the wrong in her power. These authors said that Mary's accusations of bigamy were unsupported and discredited, utter falsehood and worthless, and that she herself was disreputable and graceless. One author sneered that no charge is so easily made, so readily believed without proof, and so difficult to disprove. In the end, all the arguments came back to Batchelor's character. The charges must have been false, politically motivated slander, or just titillating fantasy, since Batchelor was an honored and respected man of gentleness, courtesy, and cultivation in excess of many of his contemporaries. And on that basis alone, they said, his memory may be said to have been cleared. So Batchelor became, in these histories, a symbol of 19th century values. According to one author, he was a high-minded but unsuccessful patriarch at variance with the narrow and doomed intent of the Bay oligarchs, spending his life in the vain search for religious freedom and rebelling at the limitations and prescriptions which time was to show were impossible in a free and gradually enlightened democracy. So in these stories, Mary Batchelor is the villainess and the minister is well-intentioned but politically persecuted. Women's words were instrumental in shaping Batchelor's career, but their influence can hardly be detected in the narratives constructed by people who were motivated to cast him in the most flattering possible light. The last case I want to look at is a little bit different than the others. In the later 17th century, the son of a prominent minister of the founding generation, a man who was born in America rather than in England, was able to rehabilitate his reputation and repeatedly find new pulpits in the aftermath of several sexual scandals. John Cotton Jr. was probably one of the brightest prospects among the first American-born generation of New England ministers. He graduated from Harvard when he was 17, and he started preaching at Wethersfield in Connecticut colony. He started preaching there when he was 19. The following year, when he was just 20, he uh, married, he became a freeman, and he stayed in Wethersfield until 1663. But he hadn't yet been formally ordained when he was forced to leave because of a scandal. In March of 1662, a council convened to hear allegations of misconduct by the young preacher. The accusations were wide-reaching, but the most serious charges concerned several women from the church. The first allegation was that he had gone into Mrs. Chittenden's chamber with Goodwife Wright, pretending merely to see the furniture of the house. The council determined that this was a foolish curiosity and a matter of no good report, but they told him that he should keep better watch over himself. The council found there was insufficient evidence to prove the second allegation, which was that he offered some kind of untoward language to a woman named Mrs. Wells. They did judge that his expressions were sinful, rash, unpeaceable, and especially considering his place in charge. So in other words, he was speaking in a way that was unbecoming of a minister. He responded by saying that Mrs. Wells was guilty of licentious, whorish practices and that her husband had given false testimony. The council sort of dismissed that and said this was a charge of very high defaming nature, rashly spoken, and in no way proved by him against her. Now, because John Cotton Jr. was not a member of the Wethersfield Church yet, he also faced disciplinary action in Boston's First Church, where he was still a member. So he wrote to John Winthrop Jr., who was another prominent founder's son, and asked for help navigating the Boston Church's disciplinary proceedings. And at this point, he admitted his guilt. He told Winthrop in sort of melodramatic fashion, "You are not a stranger to my dreadful fall. How greatly I have dishonored the glorious name of God that hath been called upon me. How much I have blemished the gospel of Jesus Christ. How sadly I have wounded mine own soul and saddened the hearts of the righteous whom God would not have made sad." He declared himself ready to, quote, "take shame to myself for the vileness of my heart and life." But despite this apparent contrition, the Boston Church excommunicated Cotton in May of 1664, and their records are a little more succinct and pointed. They said that the reason for his excommunication was his lascivious, unclean practices with 3 women and his horrid lying to hide his sin. So at this point, John Cotton Jr. moved from Connecticut to Martha's Vineyard, which is an island off the coast of Plymouth, and he served as a minister to the English settlers and a missionary to the Native Americans on the island for almost 2 years. He was then invited to the pulpit in Plymouth. The church there had had really bad luck with their ministry since John Lyford left, so this wasn't a prestigious post, but it was definitely closer to the centers of power than Martha's Vineyard had been. So he was ordained by the Plymouth Church in 1669, and he spent nearly 30 years there as their minister. He was apparently a very enthusiastic reformer. He imposed congregational order in the town, and provided them with their first real spiritual leadership. So you might think all of this had rendered all of those previous stories forgotten, but controversy once again enveloped him in the mid-1690s when he was accused of interfering in the laity's affairs and overstepping his role as minister. In October of 1697, Cotton left his pulpit at Plymouth, and at this point, Cotton was keeping the church records himself, so they're a little vague and probably of questionable reliability, but what he wrote in the records was that the aspect of providence from this time was such that made way for the pastor and church to part from one another. It's all very amicable. In a later entry in the records, it says that the church had been in an afflicted and distressed condition with reference to the troubles that happened with reference to their pastor. If we look outside those official church records, other sources tell us that this was something more than a disagreement about church governance. In June of that year, Cotton had written to his son and enclosed a record of a church meeting held at Plymouth to consider the sad and scandalous reports that had been raised and spread abroad concerning some miscarriages in the pastor toward Rebecca Morton. A council then heard the case shortly before Cotton left Plymouth, and they recorded that the church was holding a hearing because of Cotton's notorious breaches of the 7th commandment. For those of you who don't know the commandments, that's the adultery one. So when Cotton left Plymouth, the diarist Samuel Sewall noted, "Thus Christ's words are fulfilled, unsavory salt is cast to the dunghill." And Sewall was a friend of his. So none of Cotton's friends or family who reflected on the events at the time gave any indication that they doubted the accusations or that they thought he was being unfairly targeted. By July of 1698, attitudes toward him seemed to be softening a bit in some quarters, and some people were actually working to rehabilitate him. He was entertaining the possibility of a position in Malden, and others were advocating for him to have a permanent preaching position in Yarmouth. But and he was secretly preaching there sort of on a temporary basis, but his reputation wasn't healed, and people were starting to talk about the fact that his wife had not joined him in Yarmouth. So John Cotton wrote to his wife, Joanna, and said that people were gossiping about them being separated. And then when Cotton finally found another permanent position, it wasn't in Yarmouth and it wasn't in Malden. He went to South Carolina. The church at Charleston evidently didn't mind his questionable reputation because many of the members there had checkered pasts of their own. But When he left for Carolina, his wife had a really difficult decision to make about whether to join him or not, and extant letters indicate that she was pretty resistant. It's unclear whether she was resisting leaving New England or whether she was resisting joining her husband, but some New Englanders were rumored to be considering a migration to join him. And that doesn't seem to have happened before he died of yellow fever in Charleston in September of 1699. One of John Cotton Jr.'s sons, Josiah, wrote a history of his family that included a summary of his father's ministerial career. He completely erased his father's time in Wethersfield, saying only that he remained unsettled several years between his graduation from Harvard and taking up a pulpit at Martha's Vineyard. The end of his pastorate in Plymouth, the son claimed, came because the church was desirous of novelty or change, and that they used politics as an excuse to get rid of him in favor of a new, younger minister. So Josiah Cotton was trying to glorify his father's career and all of the good that he had done for his congregations. And he made no mention at all of any scandal or any suggestion that his father's career or his parents' marriage was troubled by any accusations of immorality. Incidentally, I was looking around to see if I could find a portrait of John Cotton Jr. I wasn't sure if there was one or not. And I found an entire website devoted to defending John Cotton Jr. from politically motivated accusations. And you'll be shocked, I'm sure, to learn that the website was created by one of John Cotton Jr.'s descendants. So John Cotton Jr. faced repeated accusations of sexual indiscretions. He showed hostility during councils that were summoned to address the accusations, and he insulted the women who accused him. But he also had a network of men who were friends or peers of his father, or who, like him, were sons of eminent founding settlers. And he also kept the records of the Plymouth troubles himself, which allowed him to color the scandals to his own benefit. Permanent consequences didn't catch up to him until pretty late in his life, and it was only after he lost the pulpit at Plymouth that he was unable to secure another post. The scandals he faced were part of larger disorders in those churches and probably would have stayed in the realm of rumor if not for the congregation's other concerns. But even those men who believed the charges against him and who were willing to say that to him directly, when he died, they celebrated him as a revered minister and they lamented his untimely death. By the time his son wrote the family history some decades later, the scandals were all but forgotten, at least officially. So how many other ministers were under suspicion of improper behavior? It's kind of impossible to know. Michael Wigglesworth, who was the famed author of Day of Doom, confided to his diary and to his doctor that he feared he had contracted gonorrhea before his marriage, and he filled the pages of his diary with laments about his overactive sex drive. James Sherman, the minister at Sudbury, was censured by a council for many and horrid scandals, although they were not clearly defined. Thomas Cheever, the son of the famed schoolmaster Ezekiel Cheever and minister at Malden, lost his pulpit after accusations that he violated the seventh commandment. That's the adultery one again. The cases surveyed here show that ministers whose indiscretions became well known were those whose transgressions were part of larger political arguments about their churches and their towns and their colonies. They were controversial ministers whose religious practices and political affiliations made them sources of disorder beyond the realm of sexuality. What they all shared then was a pattern of public activity that could not or would not be ignored. Though most of the allegations described sexual violations that happened out of sight of the public, they had brought scrutiny upon themselves through their political activities. And certainly many of the ministers themselves claimed that the accusations were politically motivated. But more controversial men seem never to have faced similar accusations. Even if the scandals were at heart politically motivated, it's probable that the minister's enemies were simply taking advantage of talk that had been circulating through rumor and insinuation long before the accusations entered the formal public. Repeated accusations against some ministers lent credibility to the charges against them. And perhaps once a person's reputation was suspect, they just became more vulnerable to allegations in the future. Maybe victims were more willing to share their own stories after someone else had already opened the gate. Maybe that gave them confidence that their allegations would be believed. The responses to these accusations tell us something too. While some accused ministers, like John Cotton, impugned the reputations of the women who accused them, they focused more steadily on discrediting the men who pushed the allegations into the public sphere. These cases, by and large, do not reveal a 17th century equivalent of an old boys network. They didn't close ranks, they didn't attempt to discredit the accusers, and they didn't ignore the allegations. Clerical reputation was, like community reputation, something that all ministers were responsible for maintaining. Low content warning here. The next slide has images of some prominent abusers who've been in the news over the last several years, so prepare yourself for that. So during the almost 10 years that I've been working on this project, I have often lamented that new cases seem to make it relevant week after week. When I started working on it, there were accusations against Bill Cosby in the news. And when I finished the final edits on my dissertation, I was watching the confirmation hearings for Brett Kavanaugh. And in between, there were countless stories about powerful men and the women who accused them of violence and abuse. Just in the last week, there have been at least 3 more stories making the rounds on social media. And it's not a coincidence that the Me Too movement also exploded into visibility during this time. In the present, we continue to evaluate claims based on how many women lodge accusations and on whether they told anyone at the time, and the character of the women involved. What was really powerful to me as someone who studies gossip, how gossip becomes public knowledge, was that Christine Blasey Ford stood alone, and she asked the public to believe that her story was enough, that the damage done to one woman's life was enough. So many other scandals involving powerful men have been given heft or credibility in the public conversation by the volume of accusations. And that volume also offered some kind of safety in numbers. But it leads to this inevitable question, in the assumption, stated or unstated, that these accusations just might be invented. How much evidence is enough, and whose word is enough? One of the reasons that gossip is important is that it tells us something about how people know things and how they decide what to believe. Of all the scandals that have crossed my radar over the last decade, one story has stuck with me more than any other. And this was a scandal in Canada involving a musician and a radio host who was accused by multiple women of pretty violent abuse. And when the stories began to trickle out, others revealed that there were open secrets about this man and his reputation that circulated in his social circle for years. To be protected from his alleged dangers, one would have had to know the right people and be fortunate enough to have that information shared with them. I haven't done any kind of statistical analysis, but it was also striking to me that, generally speaking, the men tended to apologize for knowing and not saying anything, while the women tended to discuss how they tried to warn people. It would be easy to say that this research is inspired by those current events, but the reality seems more that these stories and value judgments about women's talk and about women's experiences are always with us. The secrets we keep that are not really secret, and the stories that we share with each other that are not validated in official channels, the ways that women support or undermine each other with words whispered and shouted, words overheard, actions overseen. These are a constant refrain in changing historical contexts. Gossiping women share secrets that shouldn't be kept. They make decisions about sharing information that's outside the control of male authorities. Information that circulates informally is nearly impossible to control, but it can also be difficult to access for those who need it most. Women and girls use gossip to keep themselves and each other safe by making public the things that others want to keep private. None of this is meant to suggest that gossip is never harmful, but only to suggest that gossip can also prevent or mitigate harm. So, as historians love to say, it's complicated. And that's all I have prepared. I'm really eager to hear your comments and questions about Puritanism or gossip or anything else. Grumpy cat.
Thank you very much. I want to start off with a question that popped to my mind here. And I wanted to know if there was any evidence in your research about whether the words or accusations of married women differed from those of unmarried women. I noticed that in the John Cotton story, it was several married women who were saying, "This is what happened to me." And did that hold more power than those women who, perhaps did not have a man to ally with or to support them?
That's a great question. Based on my research, it seems to matter more what a woman's reputation was. So I have cases where sort of young, poor, unmarried servant girls were believed and taken very seriously. There are also cases where young, poor servant girls were not taken seriously, and the difference seems to be that the ones who were not taken seriously were women or girls who had other kinds of reputations for bad behavior, or they were suspected of being Catholic or being Quaker. So it depended a lot on the woman's reputation. It also depended a lot on the man's reputation. If a man was sort of an upstanding pillar of the community, that was a tougher sell than if somebody was sort of already a troublemaker. But no, I haven't found any difference in marital status.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense considering, for instance, the Cosby case, when we think about somebody who was an upstanding pillar of the community and, America's dad.
Right.
And
And so you don't want to believe that somebody with that kind of a reputation would be capable of sort of violating that trust. Right. It's just a lot harder to convince people who don't want to believe. But in the case of somebody like John Cotton, who's been accused of this multiple times, another woman comes forward and people say, well, yeah, we know this about him, right? It doesn't surprise us in the same way.
right, right. Yeah, we have a comment from the audience that shady characters for sure seems to be a theme with men in charge. That kind of speaks to an interesting point about power dynamics and how gossip can work as you said, a way of protecting or anything like that when you don't necessarily have a whole lot of direct power in your society.
Yeah, and what makes New England interesting is that um, ministers don't have the same kind of power that we might imagine them to have now. Because each church was self-governing by the congregants, by the members of the church, you have um, you have a situation where ministers were theoretically at least supposed to be kept in check by the people that they served. And so there are lots of um, sort of deeply theological battles over how much power a minister should have relative to the laity. Um, but these are the cases where it gets tricky to determine sort of where the power lies. And my argument is that this idea of watchfulness shifts the way that we understand how power worked, because ministers aren't immune from being watched.
Okay, we have another question coming in. This one's from Junice, and they say, hi, Melissa, thanks for this lecture. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you came to this project, knowing full well that it's probably complicated.
It's very complicated. I started out working on an Atlantic history of women's reading practices. And so I was, digging around in the primary sources and in a lot of prescriptive literature. And what I found was that the documents were much more focused on women speaking than on women reading. There didn't seem to be a lot of disagreement about how women should read or what they should read in the 17th century, sort of before the advent of the novel, but there sure were a lot of opinions about how women should talk and when they should talk and how they should listen and who they should listen to. And so I, you know, don't recommend this to any grad students who might be listening. After I had successfully defended my prospectus, I scrapped the entire thing and started over and wrote a dissertation about women speaking and focused in on gossip because of this tension that was created by this idea of watchfulness. If we are all supposed to keep tabs on each other, but women are supposed to stay silent, well, then what do you do? Then it gets really weird. And so, yeah, so it was sort of it was a complicated route, but in some ways very direct, because what I was really concerned about was how people know what they know and whether or not women contributed to that. What role did women have in the intellectual lives of their communities and on building religious culture? And I didn't expect to find as much as I did, but it turns out that women were really active in spreading information, not just the sort of stuff that I've defined as gossip, but also about you know wars and the economy and all kinds of things. And they really were taking charge of shaping their culture in pretty active ways.
Okay, great. We have a question from Virginia. Virginia, I'm going to allow you to talk here.
Oh no, she's muted.
Can you unmute yourself? I'm trying to see if I can do that as well.
Are you talking to me?
Yes, Virginia.
Oh, I didn't really have anything to say. I'm just learning how to use this, but when I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, recently I found out my 10th great grandmother was hung as a witch in Boston. Her name was Alice Lake. And so it wasn't only the men, because she was accused of adultery, so they hung her. But she had 6 children, so I don't know. But so it was a pretty rough society, or strict society, I think.
Yeah, and that's a great point that you raise. Witchcraft is sort of the ultimate consequence of gossip, right? Being accused of being a witch is one of the examples that people use a lot when they talk about the dangers of gossip, because often accusations of witchcraft came, after decades of suspicion about somebody being a troublemaker or being not quite orthodox in their religious beliefs, or otherwise suspicious. And so witchcraft is often put forward as sort of a consequence of gossip. I would propose that while that is true, it also tells us something about how we can understand the accusers, the people who accused women of witchcraft, because one of the great mysteries about Salem, for those of you who are familiar with the Salem witchcraft outbreak, one of the big questions has been, why did they believe these teenage girls who were making all of these accusations? Why in the world did people take that seriously? And if we think about how watchfulness worked, and we think about how Puritans understood the sharing of information orally, then we start to see that this isn't actually that unusual. Believing women and girls isn't out of character. It's not some kind of anomaly in Salem. So I think witchcraft is a really great way of getting at that tension between the sort of positive consequences of gossip, the way that it can protect people, but also the way that it can absolutely destroy someone.
Great. Okay, we have another question coming in. This one's from Alex. Alex asks, I'm really interested in the consequences that Sarah Lyford faced for being suspected of having independent thoughts. Based on your research, does it seem like men would have been more allowed to think outside the box, or were all members of these Puritan communities expected to largely conform?
Well, it was actually her husband who was accused of having independent thoughts rather than her. But it gets really tricky to try to figure out whether there's a gendered component to thinking independently. Certainly in the cases of the antinomians, like Anne Hutchinson, you see their gender being used as part of the demonization of those independent thoughts. And they say things like, uh, she had a monstrous birth, which was a symbol of the monstrous ideas that she was bringing forth into the world. So there are definitely sort of ways that gender makes itself known in those cases, but I'm not sure if I know enough about this to speak really confidently about, um, hmm. Yeah, I mean, the danger lied in people not adhering to community values. And so, I think that we could also say it's really dangerous for a man in a position of authority to jump outside of those boundaries. I think that the consequences may have been different for women, and also the way that those accusations were framed was certainly different, because women were seen as more vulnerable to um, the devil in his various forms. But that's something I'm going to have to think about.
That's a good question then.
Yeah.
We have one more question. And this is, with the issues of gossip being a motivator for sites like QAnon and being
Mm.
followed by not just men, but also by women and made public, is it going backwards again?
Is it going backward? I mean, I'm not sure that, well, I just have to say, as a historian, I never believe that anything is free of its historical context, but I'm not sure that there's a backward to go to, in if that makes sense. And I never meant to imply that only women gossip. I think men gossip too. We just call it something else. When men share information, we call it news. And when women share information, we call it, gossip or rumor. Um, but I think that kind of communication always has a tension, and there's always that question of reliability. When you start getting too far removed from actual observers of an event, when it's, I heard from someone who heard it from someone else who heard it from someone else, then, you start to get these real questions about reliability. And then we start getting into the world of rumor, which is different than gossip. Things like slander and rumor are, I mean, yeah, it gets technical, but they're part of their definition is they are intentionally false, intentionally meant to deceive. And that's different than gossip as I've defined it, which is just these sort of unofficial channels of communication. But I do think that social media raises all kinds of questions about how we know things and who we trust, right? Because it's different for me to say to Courtney, hey, I heard this thing that I think you should know about. We know each other. We have some kind of basis of trust. If it's, you know, uh, Shark123 on Twitter saying something, how do I know that that's even a real person, let alone somebody that I can trust to tell me reliable information? So, the wider our networks get and the more separate they are from actual personal knowledge of someone's trustworthiness, I think those questions get really complicated.
And that sets me up beautifully. Thank you for the segue to say that if you're interested in rumor and reliability of information, please come back on February 25th, because Ian King and Marianne Herning, I believe, are going to be doing, or Lindsay Keevy, sorry, are going to be doing a presentation on that from our LCC library here. So thank you so much. We're getting some thank yous in the chat as well. But I really appreciate you all coming out to hear about this new exciting research that's happening and how it might tie to the modern world that we live in today. See, the history matters. I'm a big believer in that. So thank you again to Melissa, and now is the time. Yay!
Thanks for having me.
Thank you all. See you next week.